Welcome everyone. For today's video, we're actually going to talk about another of the great early romantics, Felix Mendelssohn. And there's so much to say about Mendelssohn that I've decided to divide my discussion of this composer into two videos. And so this first video is going to concentrate on Mendelssohn's piano music and his orchestral works. And then in Mendelssohn Part 2, we'll talk about the wonderful violin concerto and his choral music, in particular, his work Elijah, his great oratorio. So like his sister Fanny, Mendelssohn grew up in an artistic family with many advantages. So born in 1809. Again, a very short life, only lived to be 1840, only lived until 1847. And Mendelssohn had many advantages growing up in the family that he did. It meant that he had the opportunity to travel, to become very well read, and to receive a systematic education in music, which he did with a well-known composer of the time named Carl Zelter. And Mendelssohn also was able to perform quite a bit as a pianist during his short career and began composing at quite a young age. And there have been many scholars who have compared Mendelssohn to Mozart in terms of being a child prodigy and the quality of the music that he was writing, even in his teenage years. So today I thought we would focus a little bit on the piano and orchestral pieces. So I thought I would start with the piano music. So in the same vein of Robert Schumann and Frédéric Chopin and Franz Schubert and many of the other great composers of this period, Mendelssohn devoted a lot of his attention to writing smaller pieces for piano, what we call character pieces, or Charakterstücke. And one of the most important collections of character pieces is a group of works that he wrote at various times during his life, eventually collected into 8 volumes that are called Lieder ohne Worte, songs without words. So a song without words is obviously just as it seems. It has a song-like element. It's going to be very lyrical and very beautiful, and you can imagine that words would have been put to it, but it does not contain any words or any lyrics. So this is a really good example of Felix Mendelssohn's wonderful gift as a writer of melody. He wrote many famous melodies, the Wedding March, that brides to this day are marching down the aisle to that wedding march, or Hark the Herald Angels Sing that we all perform during the holiday season. Many people don't know that was written by Felix Mendelssohn. And so, so I want us to listen to one short example just to kind of get things started of a piano piece by Mendelssohn. This is called Spring Song, and in the key of A major. So AM stands for A major. This was a piece that Mendelssohn wrote for Queen Victoria. And so many of you know about Queen Victoria, who was the longest reigning British monarch before the current Queen Elizabeth II. And she was a great lover of music. She was a fine amateur pianist. Her husband, Prince Albert, was an amateur composer. Queen Victoria was a regular visitor to the opera during her reign. And she and Mendelssohn struck up a friendship when he had come to London for concerts. And so he wrote this piece, probably the most famous of the songs without words, this and another work called the Gondola Song, that was intended for Queen Elizabeth to be able to assist. So it was originally, can be, of course, now played by one pianist, but it was probably originally intended where she would play the melody and Felix would take the accompaniment. So it's a very, very kind of gentle, sweet, lyrical, some would say very conservative musical style. And you're probably going to recognize the melody. It's called Spring Song. And as I'm recording this, I'm looking out and we're starting to see a few tentative signs of spring here in Michigan, a few flowers, and the sun is out and so forth. So this piece, for whatever reason, always reminds me of spring. So here's just a bit of the opening section of Mendelssohn's Spring Song from the Songs Without Words. there's a very strong family resemblance between music like that and the piano character pieces of Robert Schumann, who was a huge admirer of Mendelssohn's work. Then we move to the symphonic music. Certainly one of Mendelssohn's greatest contributions are his symphonies. He wrote 5 symphonies, 2 of them inspired by his travels when he was a young man. So Symphony number 3 is known as the Scottish Symphony. Symphony number 4 is called the Italian Symphony. It's full of Italian joyous zest of life, and includes, lively dances and so forth that he was inspired during his travels. Mendelssohn was also an amateur painter, and so we actually have some sketches and drawings and paintings that he did of his various travels, which would also influence the music that he wrote. But the piece we're going to listen to is an example of what is known as incidental music. So this became a very common feature among composers in the early 19th century to write music that would accompany the performance of a play, or maybe the reading of a poem or something like that. And so we have examples of incidental music by Beethoven and by Schubert, but Mendelssohn's are probably the best known, in particular this piece, which was inspired by Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Mendelssohn was very passionate about Shakespeare, as were most of the writers of this time. We talked in the previous video about how much Berlioz loved Shakespeare. Well, Mendelssohn did too. And so he had read Midsummer Night's Dream in German translation and was inspired initially to compose an overture, which wonderfully depicts the fairy world of Titania and Oberon and the figures in the original Shakespeare play. And then a number of years later was asked to compose additional incidental music for a full performance of Midsummer Night's Dream with musical interpolation. So that took place in 1842. The overture from 1826 was written when Mendelssohn was only 17 years old and is one of the most extraordinary examples of orchestral music by any composer written at that age. Also, I would just mention that the famous Wedding March from Midsummer Night's Dream is one that is still heard very frequently to this day. So I thought we would listen to just a little bit of the Scherzo movement from the incidental music for Midsummer Night's Dream. This one, I think, very much illustrates the lively fairy world of Oberon and Puck and all the characters, if you remember from those of you that have studied Midsummer Night's Dream. It's one of Shakespeare's lightest, most delightful plays. So here's just a bit of the opening of the Scherzo from Midsummer. So that's just a little taste in the hope that you'll go and listen to the entire piece on your own. So there's so many other wonderful examples of Mendelssohn's orchestral music. His symphonic tone poem called The Hebrides, better known as Fingals Cave, was inspired by a visit that he made to Scotland and is considered really the prototype for the concept of a single movement orchestral work that depicts a scene from nature or a play or poetry or something like that. And so later 19th century composers like Franz Liszt and Richard Strauss would be very influenced by Mendelssohn in writing their own versions of tone poems. So it's hard to imagine a great work by Strauss like Also sprach Zarathustra, which many people know from its use in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's hard to imagine that work without the example of Mendelssohn. So even though a lot of people tend to think of Mendelssohn as a more conservative composer, than, say, Berlioz, and that is certainly true. He did use a more traditional symphony orchestra. He did use a harmonic palette that was much closer to that of Beethoven or Schubert than, say, Liszt or Berlioz or Wagner. But that doesn't mean that he didn't do things that were very, very ahead of their time and very creative, especially in his use of program music. So in the next video, we're going to talk about some of the amazing innovations that we see in Mendelssohn's best-known concerto, the Violin Concerto in E minor, and some of the remarkable music that he wrote in his last major work, which is his oratorio, Elijah. And so we will see you back here next time for Mendelssohn Part 2.